Department of Education, who will spend some time discussing rethinking accountability and assessment in New Hampshire. And this is very appropriate for our committee to hear, because we know we have three House bills that we will be that are in interim studies that we will be studying over the summer. So it's good to have a heads up in terms of what the department is thinking about. So with that, welcome to House Education, Commissioner Barry and Scott Manti. And the screen is there if you would like.
I think we'll just probably go with our handouts. You have them, and we'll just kind of work through it. I think that probably would be easier.
Come up a little closer if you want to sit on the table. Or on it, rather.
Oh, all right. Well, as always, it's great to be here. I think what's important, maybe just kind of update everybody. You know that a year ago that we had the option of seeking a waiver in the state, and several states went ahead and went forward. The purpose of the waiver was to give greater flexibility to states in terms of several different things. One in particular was looking at new ways of looking at assessment. The second element of it was to reduce the amount of paperwork that was expected from all of our title programs. And the third element of it was to give greater flexibility in terms of title funds, in terms of spending. So we've spent the last year working with school districts, giving them an opportunity to rethink how they're using their federal money specifically. And one of the big requests nationally is that they have greater flexibility. For our state, that really represents mostly Title I funds. We do have several other titles. We have Title III, which is English as a second language. It's a fairly small grant for our state, but Title I is the one that it really has greater significance. Also, our IDEA funds. And while there is several restrictions with special needs children, it did give greater flexibility in how funding was spent. And also, the other one I think is important to mention is Title IIA. And Title IIA is professional development funds. And as you all know, that's quite a cost for a school district. So we're able to rethink how we would use our Title II funds with our school districts, and that's turned out this year to be very, very helpful. So now we have an option, again, to consider as a state. Oh, and by the way, I just want to mention that the first waiver that we went through, all the school districts had an opportunity to weigh in as to whether or not they wanted us to go forward. And we had, with the exception of 2 school districts that were just worried, all of our other school districts voted in favor of seeking the waiver. So essentially, we're in a second round of waivers. The applications have not been sent out by the Secretary of Education yet, but this waiver is offering even more to states in terms of flexibility. As you know, New Hampshire goes between the 5th and 6th highest performing state in the country. We still really are moving forward for our students. We really want to make sure that they get the best possible education. So this waiver gives us an opportunity to rethink our accountability system. But I want to say right up front, it does not eliminate standardized testing, and that's really important. Any state, and I've sent this document to several people, any state that is engaged in accepting federal dollars must have a statewide assessment system, and also New Hampshire has a law that you must participate in the statewide assessment. I think all of you over the last few months know that we have moved to Smarter Balance, and I'm really pleased to say that on a voluntary basis over the last few months, many school districts in New Hampshire volunteered for Smarter Balance. And the feedback that we've gotten both at the high school, middle school, and elementary level has been really terrific. And that is that the students didn't want to stop to go on the playground, nor did they want to take their breaks at the high school level. So we're very, very excited about that. And as we move forward this year, we'll begin to understand a little bit more about the impact. So why go to a flexibility waiver? And that is, if you just turn to this page and it has various shapes, why are we doing this? Well, what's really important is, what are the drivers that improve public education? And, what is it that we're really looking for our students? We are looking to place a greater emphasis on teaching and learning. This has been the direction over the last 5 years of the department, supporting our teachers. As you know, the teaching evaluation process for all teachers has gotten national recognition because New Hampshire was the only state that gave it back to school districts to develop, that they could develop their teacher evaluation system. It is only required of Title I schools, but I'm very proud to say as commissioner that probably with little exception, every school district took very seriously the importance of an evaluation tool that provided teachers with the support that they need to be successful in our classrooms. There are many issues with No Child Left Behind. As you know, it created unhealthy competition. And if you remember last year when I spoke, I said that in the year 2015-16, New Hampshire would have, according to the NCLB formula, 97% of our schools would be failing, and the following year we would be presented as a state of 100% failing schools because of the formula. But at the same time, we are between the 5th and 6th highest performing state in the nation. So there's a lot of confusion about these various assessments and No Child Left Behind. While it started out really great, the whole idea that no child would be left behind really did turn into a very unhealthy, competitive process in our schools, including, I'm sure some of you have heard this many times, communities feeling that their schools were failing and feeling very, very deflated by that kind of process. So we moved away from that kind of competitive, putting the most failing school in the paper to looking at all of our schools as, a new way to be able to promote teaching and learning. So there are nationally testing concerns, too much testing, not enough testing, and so New Hampshire, in our movement towards flexibility, is looking at what we refer to as assessment. If Smarter Balance, you'll see as we go forward, will be offered in the spring of the year before the child enters the next grade. It provides teachers with sort of an understanding of proficiency in reading, writing, and mathematics. Those are the only assessment elements. And if we get to Smarter Balance today, Scott Manting is here to talk about that. So the purpose of assessment is to give the teachers in the individual communities and schools an opportunity to determine what the child needs. And that's all an assessment does. And I think some of you have heard me say before, it's like any other kind of pediatric assessment. And that is, where does a student stand? What are their proficiency levels? How can I improve my teaching? And how can I improve learning in my class? That is all an assessment does. And that's where we are in our thinking. NCLB really was a very top-down approach. And this flexibility waiver that we're hoping to put in would give our school districts greater control over what assessments they use on a daily basis, which is referred to as formative assessment. Sort of looking every day at where kids are, and a once-a-year summative assessment, and that would be the Smarter Balance. So in the next page there, it just kind of gives you an overview of an evolution of accountability, starting with many years ago, for all of us, in the 50s and 60s, assessments were given all over the country, whether it was the Iowa test, the Metropolitan test, the CPT. There were all kinds of tests being given even back in the 40s and 50s. Everybody probably remembers sitting through torturous hot days in the month of June taking the test. So we've come a long way, and you'll see if you just look at the fourth little circle there, we selected the ESE waiver, as I mentioned before, to give some flexibility to our schools. They're enjoying that flexibility. And then we're up to this new waiver process. We anticipate the application will come out this summer, and by then we would have worked very closely with our school districts to see where they are. So it's kind of a policy shift in our country right now, that we're moving from external to internal. And the thinking is that, and I think this is very, very healthy for us, and the thinking is that every community in any state is very different. And I know my experience over the last 5 years is, while we are naturally as American citizens interested in the competition of, are we better than Massachusetts, how do we fare with Vermont, and so on and so forth, this flexibility waiver would give us an opportunity for school districts, essentially, within a school and a district, for them to look specifically at the cultural elements of their school and what would contribute to success of all children. And so this flexibility waiver represents a district's ability to be able to develop within their culture the kinds of assessment that they would be able to use on a daily basis. So if you just look at these are probably good reasons to shift. Research on organizational change or reform or human learning supports the idea that real change or learning must be internally motivated. That there has to be a reason within our teaching profession as well as within our children and our community to want the best kind of learning. So it has to be more unique to each community and child. That drive is fueled by a combination of autonomy. And that applies to all of us as human beings, that we have to have free choice. That most of us in our work are looking for mastery. We want to be good at what we do, and we know children want that also. And that there's a purpose behind learning and a purpose behind the work that we do. So essentially it moves away from a controlled top-down model to an influence model. And that's what we've been working on the last 5 years. How do we provide support to schools instead of being punitive? And saying, you're not reaching the standard, but now how can we help you reach that standard? So the current accountability systems were motivated by No Child Left Behind, and now we're looking to a more internalized kind of assessment program. So we think of it as a responsibility system, and if you just turn to that page, we're interested in fostering more internally oriented approaches to accountability. I draw everyone's attention, I think most of you are familiar with the work that's gone on at Pittsfield in the last 5 years, the amazing work that's gone on because of strong leadership, very, very committed community work, including businesses, parents, and so on and so forth, that essentially, because of putting the right pieces together, getting the right kinds of teachers that could be retained within Pittsfield. I mean, there was a time where if you couldn't get a job anywhere else, you went to Pittsfield. And then they lost teachers. Their retention rate was down in the area of about 38%. And we define retention by a teacher stays at a minimum 4 years in the district. And they were down at 38%. Huge issues for a community that needs great support. But with the work of strong leadership at the district level, the community support, the changing of teachers that were invested in a new vision for their community, I'm very pleased to say that literally 5 years ago, they were in the bottom 10%, and they are now in the top 10% in mathematics. This is huge accomplishment that happened as a result of complete and full community engagement in kids' learning, and I think that's really important. If we're going to move forward from good to great, and this is always something that's open for some debate in the people of minds, is good enough? And I believe that the citizens of New Hampshire and policymakers are looking for our students to move from good to great, that they will have all the options available to them in their lives as they move forward. You can't do that on a large scale, and that's what I think we're learning nationally, that this has to be really directed at individual school districts. So it's kind of, I think a good way to think of it is a responsibility system, that districts will take on greater responsibility, and some people refer to it as local control. My own sense would be that local is one word and responsible is another. And we think of it as a responsibility system as we move forward. So our current design, and I want to just mention that I'm very sensitive to people feeling there's too much testing. The only test that the state of New Hampshire administers is one currently, and that is the NECAP. We just finished our administration of that. We will not be administering another test until spring of 2015, and that is the only test that the state of New Hampshire administers. We are required by state and federal law. Schools today are very engaged in formative assessment, and formative assessment takes on many, many different perspectives. Many of our schools are involved in what's called the NEWAs, and the NEWA is an assessment that's used for reading proficiency in math. Schools decide how they want to use that. It's purchased by a school. It is on a computer. It can be used on a weekly, a monthly, a bi-monthly basis. It's not across the whole state. It's a local district decision to do that. There are all kinds. You probably have heard of AimsWeb. So districts themselves determine what kinds of assessment they want to use, and they make that choice. That has nothing to do with the state of New Hampshire Department of Education or federal. That is a choice that they make. So in a sensitivity to parents, I think that the recognition that some parents really feel there's a lot of testing. We've had this pretty deep discussion at the state level, working with school districts for them to reevaluate how much actual testing they're doing within the school environment, and that's something they're looking at. So under our current design, we are a smarter balanced state. Just for your edification, New Hampshire did not make a decision for 3 years. There was enormous policy input into whether we would go with PARCC, which is a paper pencil test. New York decided to do that. Most very large states went with paper pencil, and states like ours went with smarter balance. We felt it was a more holistic form of assessment, and it allowed us to integrate technology, which we know children are very motivated by. So the current design right now is that in 3rd through 8th, we take a smarter balance once a year in the spring. It is over a 12-week period of time, and so we've been able to tackle some of the issues you all identified in the last couple of years about bandwidth and how many computers in the school, and so on and so forth. So that would be 3rd through 8th, and then in the 11th grade. That's the overall assessment plan currently. So with the flexibility waiver, what we are hoping to propose as we continue talking about where we'd like to go and give our school districts greater flexibility, that there would be cohorts of school districts that might decide, and this is the way I'd like to think about it. There are 3 options that we're kind of developing. The first option is you stay as a smarter balance school 3 through 11. That's your choice. We've had many districts express already they like that choice. They'd rather stay 3rd through 11th grade with smarter balance. Conceptually, and please remember, this is conceptually, the second choice would be, and this comes from Rick Ladd when I first met him, 6 years ago now, the discussion about NECAP. And we know that statewide, and this was true in Maine and Vermont, that NECAP presented a problem at the high school level from participation standpoint and from students' willingness to engage in NECAP. And from the education world, one would say that the NECAP didn't follow students into the military, into post-secondary, nor did it follow them into jobs. So there was a huge contingency, if you remember, of people that said, why don't we just get rid of the NECAP at 11th grade? And so this, yes, and Representative also said the same thing. So in this process of rethinking how we might be more flexible, we went to our superintendents and said, if we could get a waiver and you could offer the SATs at 11th grade and the PSATs if you wanted to at your own cost in 9th grade, what would you think? With the exception of 3 school districts, all said this would be terrific. Our parents would love it. It would be a savings in our school districts. As you know, resources are getting more and more difficult. We've been talking with the College Board, SAT, they've been in the state several times, talking about would they give us a special deal if our school districts wanted to do the SATs in 11th grade. It's savings for parents. Now, we would only pay for it once. The district might do a 9th grade PSAT because that kind of gives you a good indication of students' strengths and weaknesses. We would, as a state, hypothetically, pay for the SAT at the 11th grade. And this is a huge shift of thinking for all of us, because the SAT, for all students, whether they choose the military, a career, they will always have the option to enter into part-time education at the secondary level over a lifetime. So this is important. It's a consideration. The other model is, most of you are somewhat familiar, is New Hampshire's been recognized for performance-based assessment. And performance-based assessment is competencies. Now, as a parent and a grandmother, I love the idea. And I can't imagine how we could ever put it separate, and that is that every student would be competent. That reading proficiency, right now, the state of New Hampshire is at a 57% reading proficiency. That is far below the capacity of our students. And many students, and I've heard it from all of you in some way or another, they move on to a different grade level and they're still not proficient in reading. And it is the absolute most essential skill as it relates to any area in school. If you cannot read at proficient or above by 3rd grade, the likelihood that you will be successful in middle school has been reduced by 54%, and the likelihood by 9th grade that you will complete high school and go on to college has been reduced yet again at the 67% level. So the third option that we have been talking about as a state is performance-based assessment. And that would allow school districts who choose to have a competency-based model at all of their grade levels, that the student is able to demonstrate their competencies in reading, math, science, and so on and so forth, their ability to communicate, articulate, write, would be demonstrated through project learning in their school. And this is a huge, New Hampshire is leading the country in this area. Who wouldn't want competent children? You know, you really have to, when you really dig down and you start to think about the enormous changes we've gone through in this country, we still know that way too many kids are graduating. And you hear it all the time. You hear it from the business people. So this opportunity to have option C of competency-based is tricky because it doesn't necessarily involve a standardized test. It's one that we believe when we finally get to that point, meeting with the secretary, what we would propose is option C, where we would initially start out with competency or performance-based, and the students would take Smarter Balance once in high school. So that we could do a pilot study, and those districts that do the competencies, let's look at, is there a relationship between a standardized test and competent students? You know, let's really consider that as a possibility. Another element of the waiver, and I really want to be very clear on this, would be that a district, and this has caused a huge discussion in our state, and I can tell you that it will not be accepted by the secretary. We proposed the possibility that a district, on their own, would design their own assessment system. And it will not fly. We will not be able to accept federal dollars. I've asked for the ability to waive a school district. As Commissioner of New Hampshire, I have no authority to put a waiver for an innovative school. It's not within my ability to influence. I've asked, if we go forward with the waiver, to have some authority from the federal government to waive a district that's doing very innovative work and enable them to sort of pick it up and keep moving with it. So the model that in rethinking accountability, I just want to make sure that's where we are. We're looking for a college and career ready assessment system, and we're hoping to move toward a performance assessment of competency, which is referred to as PACE, a performance assessment system where it really looks at competencies in students. We have several high schools, and maybe this fall, Representative Guile, we certainly would be glad to have our high schools that are working in this area to meet with the House to talk about what they're doing in competencies. This is kind of the last couple of pages, is just, you know, what a system would look like. As I mentioned before, option A, 3rd through 8th grade and 11th grade would be Smarter Balance. Option B would be 3rd through 8th grade, Smarter Balance and SAT at the high school level. The third option would be where we would be able to grant waivers to districts that are doing very innovative practices. And that's where we're rethinking. And I must say that, you know, every time we talk about these things, there's always a different interpretation. You've heard me say before, and I want to share it again, and that is the 3 drivers for us has been communication, working closely with policymakers. I think we're very, very visible, and I think you all are aware of that. Not only with you, but in our school districts, communication, communication, communication. The second element is collaboration, that we know that if we all work together for our kids, for everyone's kids, that we can do a better job. And whatever we come up with has to be coherent. It has to make sense to the public, and it has to make sense to people. And that's been the 3 drivers that we've used as we've moved along in these efforts to improve public education. Questions? Yes, Representative Brown.
Thank you very much. As a result of when No Child Left Behind began back in early 2002 thereabouts, it was mandated that we do the statewide assessment, grades 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then again in high school level. Has there been any thought or consideration in the department where we might return to where some of us at one time did grades 4, 6, 8 and let school districts decide what might transpire in the off year.
Right. Well, that's a discussion we're having, and I've expressed this several times to Representative Guile. If the Secretary of Education were to say, we're going to delay for a year, New Hampshire has already signed on publicly, we would do a delay. We have also, and we would definitely support a reduction of assessment at the elementary level. In fact, there's been several discussions that maybe we would do 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade. So we're open to any combination. The reason why 3rd grade is so important is the reading proficiency element. That's the key thing with 3rd, but we are definitely open to having every other year or 3 times in the elementary level assessment. So if that becomes available to us, or that discussion, we can open that. We've already had that in our thinking. So yes, that's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I just want to make sure I have the options correctly written down. It would be, stays SBAC. 2 would be the SAT or PSAT. 3 would be the performance-based or competency-based. And then 4 would be the Commissioner's ability to grant waivers if something innovative was going on in the district. And I think you indicated that Commissioner or Secretary Duncan will not, has he indicated that he would not?
Yes, as it stands right now. And again, everything's sort of, this is that period in time where everything's very hypothetical. In concept, it's in a concept state. And we've already heard that at this point in time, he is not willing to entertain a system that doesn't have, a waiver process that allows a district to singularly develop their own assessment system. That's the thinking right now we're hearing. I think we're in a very complex time in this country right now. There's a lot coming at everybody about what's the right thing to do for children, and I think there's still some openness to it. But I want to reinforce that as a state, we are prepared to go forward with that if that becomes available to us.
Thank you. With the actual waiver request, then, you're going to submit one of these 3 options, or you're going to submit these as options to be chosen by the local students?
Here's how the process works. We develop our model. Well, first we work with all our school districts, okay, and get feedback, because we can't go forward on anything unless the districts feel this is a good move to go forward. So once we do that, then we have to meet with the secretary and his staff. And we have to say, this is what we're thinking, and this is why we're thinking it, and this is what we think we can do. And as mentioned before, one of the few states that really did get off the ground teacher and principal evaluation without union. We have tremendous union support. And so we have a certain confidence level in Washington that New Hampshire is a go-to, get-done state. All right, so we have a good premise. So we go, we throw our whole model out there. There's usually about 8 to 10 people, and they ask us amazing questions. I mean, we have to be prepared to answer those. And then usually we wait about 6 weeks. We'll get a call from Pat Johnson, who is our representative on our waiver process, and they'll start to get experts across the country asking us. It took us 1 solid year, the year before last, to get them to move into the flexibility waiver that we currently have. And I just really want to say for the record, during that entire process, we never gave up the values of New Hampshire. And if you haven't read our waiver, it is very specific that New Hampshire has a set of core values and principles that guides the work in our state. And we stuck it out, and we stuck it out. And finally, my own feeling was they kind of like, all right, just let them do it. And we've proven in the last year that we can do the kinds of things that other states haven't been able to accomplish to support children.
Thank you. You'd mentioned that current waiver that was submitted last year, you worked with school districts, and you'd be doing that again.
Yes.
Do you work with the superintendent or the school board? What's that process like?
I think there's the system is very stratified. We work very closely with our superintendents. That's the only group that I have contact with. And, the expectation is that the superintendents are working with their school boards. And I personally work closely with many school boards, but our current school board association has not engaged in the discussions of reform. And that's their choice. They are a private organization that chooses, they're invited to all of our meetings. And again, they're a private organization that can choose as they want to. I meet all of the time with school boards, principals. I go on the average to 2 schools a week and meet with parents. And so I feel that when decisions get made by superintendents, they're pretty honest. If they don't think their community will support, for example, the SAT, there were 3, as I mentioned before, school districts where they felt the parents would be very frightened of an SAT requirement. And so, with that said, we'll work with that school district, but ultimately the community will be part of the decision making. So yes, it's a very inclusive process. But that doesn't mean everyone's going to agree. And that's what's important.
Representative Bowman had a question.
Yes.
Representative Lyon.
Thank you. Yeah, years ago I brought up the issue about the high school kids blow off that they could care less, doesn't mean anything with the SATs. But a question on, you had mentioned Title I. If some school district wanted to do some more innovative testing, now, and you said the commissioner, the Secretary of Education would approve that, but would the state lose Title I, or would just that district lose Title I?
Again, it's in statute for state and federal, if you accept federal dollars. If I were to get the secretary to agree to give me the authority, I don't have that authority as a state employee, and I don't have it as a federal representative. So if we were to get them to agree to allow us to have a district develop their own assessment system, it'll be a huge stretch in these times, because right now, as I said before, they are absolutely requiring a statewide assessment. So that's kind of the best answer I can give you. The current model that we're in right now with priority schools and focus schools, remember the goal is over a 3-year period that a school that's failing or students aren't progressing is to give them enormous support to be able to help them move forward. I've been asked so many times about federal money. I can tell you that there are school districts in our state that would never survive without their federal dollars. So it's a jeopardy. But if they would give us that opportunity, we would propose it, but I can assure you there would be enormous criteria attached to it to be able to move forward. But Pittsfield is a great example of a town, a community that said we can do this. And I think that it's been recognized, as you probably know, nationally. We have people visiting our state all the time to see what happened in the town of Pittsfield. That really brought about this, what's considered a rapid turnover in student performance. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
Representative Lyon, you had another
Yes,
question.
thank you, Madam Chair. In Education Week, I think going back about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an article that they had interviewed Arnie Duncan, and he said there's several, 2, 3, 4 states that may lose their waiver. I think he quoted Kansas and Washington, the recipient of the Smart Balanced Money. We worked real hard to protect our local rights in this state to evaluate our teachers at the local level. And we put that in the statute. Have you heard anything from on high that our waiver could be in jeopardy due to the fact of our statutory language?
No, absolutely not. All of the work that's gone on the last couple of years, 3 to be exact, really positioned us. And in fact, the evidence that we have to be able to provide, we are in no jeopardy at all. We are in a situation where our school districts have moved forward with the evidence we need to show that not only Title I schools, but all schools went into and engaged in a serious effort to have a quality teacher evaluation and principal evaluation. So I think that's really important. What's interesting, I think the national conversation is that the next evaluation will be at the superintendent's level. That there should be a superintendent evaluation that's utilized within the state. So we'll see where that goes. But yes, no, we're in good, really, I want to say excellent standing with our waiver. We've met the indicators.
Sure.
So have you had any criticism or concerns given back from school districts regarding the sample evaluation or effective teacher model that was put forward? I know we didn't adopt it, you have to use it for the whole state, but it's there available.
Right.
Have you heard any criticism from schools?
Well, no, because they have the option to develop it the way they want. So so here are the kinds of questions. I mean, every day there's questions, millions of questions asked. So let's go back to options. Option A is you adopt the state model. The one we put, it's just a model.
Yeah.
If you want to adopt it. Option B is you look at the state model and you design it to meet your district's needs. And option C is you develop it from soup to nuts yourself. As long as you have a fair system with a policy attached to it, that's exactly the way it's done. In our Title I schools, they must have one. All other school districts that chose on their own, non-Title I schools, did that because it was the right thing to do. It was a moral imperative that teachers need to be told whether or not they are performing and supporting the needs of children. So it was taken very seriously, and that's something we should all be very proud of, that we're not setting up bifurcated systems. Public education is, as you all know, is about access and offering every citizen the right to an education. So in a state like New Hampshire, where we really want our teachers to be effective teachers, it just made sense to people. Let's get a system in place. And I would say with great pride, they did it. And they're still working on it. And the other thing that's really important is there was no pressure put on school districts. No one said, you will have this done, because obviously we can't do that anyway, but no one said you have to do it. The Title I schools had to have a system in place by 15-16, but they could test out the system over the next 5 years. So when you really think about it from a clinical standpoint, you work together and collaborate to develop the system, then you try out the system, and if it works, then do you tie it then to see if your children are becoming more proficient in the performance areas in schools. So that's kind of how it worked in New Hampshire. And again, that's a collaborative effort on people's parts.
Questions, further questions? I guess my question is, my concern, and you are well aware of my concern. At a national level, is there any conversation going on with the continuing diminishing resources available for public education as to how important the continuation of testing grades 3 through 8 is in comparison to professional development of teachers, and also because when we get the Program for International Student Assessment result, we as a nation are going down and down and down compared to countries on an international level that do not test in the grade 3. They have high stakes testing at the upper level, but no summative assessments in the elementary, or what we would call the elementary grades. Is there any kind of conversation going on? I know there is in the early childhood community, but generally speaking, relative to the importance of testing at that level.
I think there is a national conversation. You know, could we reduce the amount of testing? And I think, you know, what I've learned in the last 5 years, I had no contact at all with federal programming or anything like that, so I think I can be somewhat objective. I think the conversation is there, but there's a fear element. You know, the country is a very competitive nation, and you know, as people go to Finland and they go to Singapore and they look at all these kinds of things, there is also in those models very, very different elements of a society. And so I think what we're engaged in is the fact that we even have a waiver opportunity. I think it's moving us closer. And I want to really say this again, if we were given the opportunity to skip testing, as Representative Ladd mentioned, we will do that. We will go forward as a state, because I completely support the reduction of more testing at our elementary level, and more meaningful testing at the high school level. So I think we're getting closer, but the heterogeneous element of our country has made it really, really complex to be able to do that. And it's, you know, I think it's one of those national debates that's just going to be on all of us to make the best decisions we can, you know, in light of it. But I think last Sunday, the New York University did a national public presentation on all the concerns about testing. There were psychiatrists, educators, whatever, and they said that, and I thought it really made sense to me. It said that it is a national debate, it's a national concern, but it's adults, and we have to be focused on making the right decisions. And we're not going to agree on everything, but sometimes our hands are tied. So yes, we would look forward to skipping grades or reducing it at maybe 2 levels in our state if we are giving that option. I think the national concern is We are still in a very competitive mode, and we can't get a national philosophy, so to speak. That's what our problem is. We can't, because everybody wants that independence locally, statewide, region-wide, nation. I mean, Mary, Representative, you go out west all the time. You see what they're doing. If California is struggling, I mean, they're like a country, 4 countries, there's 497 languages spoken here. So when you get back then to a state like New Hampshire, it seems like it really would be in our control. So I think that's the basis of what we keep presenting. We want the flexibility because our state has a greater homogeneity to it, and we have a different commitment in this state. So it's that's where it is.
Keep it going. Representative Bowman and Representative Ladd.
Just a follow-up on that, at our last New England Board of Higher Ed meeting, we had discussed this, and it came up with numbers that if we took all 50 states as 50 different countries and compared them with the rest of the world, Massachusetts would be close to being #1, and New Hampshire is also in the top 10. But then you've got these other states that are way down the bottom, which is dragging everybody else down. So,
Well, that's a great point, and that's kind of the thinking that we've been using as we move forward with the flexibility waiver. Come on, guys, if we're a high-performing state and we know where we need to go, I mean, we're one of the few states that's closed the gap on special needs children. We're one of the few, in fact, the NAEP results will be coming out on May 7th. Yet again, we've improved in that area, the gap closing. So we have a lot of foundational work already laid for us to get more flexibility. And, they look closely at states like New Hampshire because, I mean, we're not even the size of Los Angeles. I mean, that's unbelievable. We're not even the size of Los Angeles in terms of students. We only have 19,000 students enrolled in our schools. So when you think of that as a sample size, that's all there is. Excuse me, 19,000 teachers, 189,000 students. I'm sorry, I got the mix. Yeah, 189,000 students. Yeah.
Representative Ladd.
Well, I ask questions, but you just mentioned we're closing the gap. What evidence do you have that we're doing something right? What are we doing to close that gap? Is it that we're getting better qualified teachers? Are we spending more time in teaching reading or mathematics? Are we all online and able to get diagnostic stuff back quicker than we had? What's causing this gap to shrink in New Hampshire versus elsewhere it may not be happening?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of factors that impact. I think that the alignment of professional development, response to intervention, giving teachers. This is a whole other discussion another day, but we have put an enormous amount of pressure on our preparation programs that they are not teaching in their preparation programs what we need to support our schools. And this is a national problem, but in New Hampshire we're working really closely with the preparation program, public and private, to make sure that the teachers we're graduating are competent teachers that can work in our field. I think we have in the state of New Hampshire teachers that really care, and they need a lot of support. Because if you graduated from college 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 5 years ago, when you look at the complexity of kids today and families and the issues that teachers are faced with, schools, you may have heard the report last week, 19,000 students in New Hampshire are in after-school programming. Of that 19,000, over 6,000 are getting dinner because they have no food at home. I mean, these are things that are really startling. We have our breakfast programs, all of our Title I programs, and then lunch programs. Free and reduced lunches have gone up by 17%. So there's a lot going on. But I think the commitment is really there, and commitment is a huge element of it. People want the right thing by kids. So I think it's a process. It's a little bit of everything, but everyone has to know what it is we have to do to get to the point where all kids have a chance, at least a chance.
Sure, go ahead.
Are we seeing the gap close in districts where you have a higher than 40% count in free and reduced? Or are we getting this data in from districts which do not have some of the issues that maybe Manchester has, or some of the larger communities which have a higher level of poverty?
Well, that's a difficult amount of data, because one of the things that we've learned, and I think want to go back to Pittsfield, and we have seen this in several districts, is that it isn't about the test scores. In the early years of making and bringing about transformation in your school district, it's really about the culture. It's about the leadership. It's about everyone knowing what the vision is. What do you expect from the kids in your school? Are there high expectations that your kids can perform regardless of their socioeconomic group? Those are the things that have to happen long before a test has any meaning. And that's where we are. That how do we give the support culturally to the school to be sure it's safe and secure, and that the teachers there have the support they need to be effective, and that you have a leader that's committed to the community. Those are the things that make the difference. And then someday you say, wow, look at the performance change. Yes, and we are seeing it in our what we call SIG schools, our schools in need of improvement. We're seeing slight changes. And again, a test, an assessment is only that. If all the other areas aren't changing at the same time, it's like a graphic equalizer. It's always going like this. So there has to be a very strong vision in the school. And in our worst failing schools, we can tell you without exception what the problems are, without exception. And I'd be more than happy to share that with you.
Can you identify a couple of those indicators where your worst schools and what the
Yes, we
indicators
can
are?
identify those. That's how clear it is. Would you want me to say them?
Well, if you have one or two, you could just allude
Okay.
to them.
First and foremost is the leadership.
Pardon me?
The leadership.
Yes.
That the principal, superintendent, knows what they're doing. You know, and so that's the pressure we put on our programs. We can't send out leaders. One in particular that we've identified is communication. You cannot change something in a school, like, I'll give you an example. Don't send home report cards with grades unless you talk to your community about why, what's the rationale, how is it going to benefit kids, will they still get into college if they don't have grades? There's a million different things that you have to consider. But if you don't know how to communicate with the public, if you can't get out there and open the door, then you are not an effective leader. Because people want leadership. They want people that can explain and help them understand. Because I believe that every parent wants what's right for their child. Whether it's a charter school, a homeschool program, it doesn't matter. Parents want that, but they also want people to help them understand why change takes place. That is one of the most critical things. The second part of it is teachers being accountable on a daily basis to the children in their class. Feeling that they have freedom and autonomy to work with the leader in the school to identify what the kids need most in their classes. And then after that, it's maybe curriculum, you know, it's the autonomy, you know, it's that representation of, you know, everyone in the school being really committed to the kids.
The story of Pittsfield is really quite extraordinary.
It is.
Though, because I was consultant to Pittsfield when I was in the Title I office, and I mean, you're right, you know, it was sort of the dregs of, I didn't even want to go there and see the Title I program. But what's so evident about the change that has occurred there is that we are getting the letters to the Concord Monitor from people who live in Pittsfield, not only about the educational system, which they are applauding, but other things that are going on in that community. You never saw a letter from anyone in Pittsfield, other than it was a major complaint, but now so it seems like the community has come alive. And is really worried and wants to make Pittsfield, a great place to live.
Right. So I think it's a balance. You know, it's leadership that says all kids can make it, whatever their choices are in life, and then you raise the expectations of the community. I mean, let's face it. Most people have had negative experiences in school. You know, whether it's your children, your grandchildren, your friends' children, and so we all hold on to those. So people need to regain confidence in their schools. You know, all these research says everyone loves their local school, but everyone complains about it. So, you know, it's maintaining that balance that recognizes that if people keep having negative experiences, whether I was a high school student or I never really learned to read or write, then of course I'm going to have those feelings. So you need a leader who can reach out and say, that's old, that's gone now. We care about your kids. Your kids can be successful. Your kids can be where they want to be in their lives. And those are choices those kids will make, but they have to have choices. They have to have choices. And you have no choices if you cannot read and write and communicate. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what job you have in our society, what military, it doesn't matter. And so that's what matters. Somebody who works with the community and gets out there. You know, and we have a lot of problems with resources. You know, we're worried about our building aid issues. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is support schools. So, you know, sometimes schools have to go over the 20 in a class. But what are they doing that's really important in the school to deal with that overage for a year? So rather than being a punitive model, trying to work with those schools because they can't build a new building. So what are the other ways that we can help them with resource issues? So minimum standards. You know, those are the kinds of things. What's minimum, but what's real? You know, what's really important? And that's, I think, we have to be. We have to say what's important and what will make sure that these kids have options and choices in their lives.
Another question, does anyone else want to ask? Right, Representative Vlad, and okay.
It's okay, you can ask, and
Representative
I'll ask later.
Vlad,
that's
and
fine.
then Representative Rokas, and then I guess Scott came to respond to specific questions on Smarter Balance.
Chairwoman, if you would, I just came here that if questions emerged, I was just here to answer
All
those
right,
very
okay.
specific, so I have no other agenda than
All
that, so I'm here
right,
at your service. So.
Thank you. Representative
Well,
Vlad, and then
maybe
Representative.
I'll go with that one first, because I had two. One was, have you had any pushback on the standards for mathematics, where we're going 3 and then embedding the 4th? But I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, the Smarter Balanced assessment, which will be validated this June, have you heard back, or is there any plan, once you finish this piloting phase that you're in, is there going to be feedback back to this committee regarding the areas of plus and minus that you're discerning from this test, and basically what the rest of the nation's getting back in terms of validation?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Our plan is to do a full onset project at the end of this. And we'll start off with by sending out some surveys, but then what we want to do is pull some focus groups together and to collect that information for 2 reasons. One of which is to allow those schools that are now engaged in the field test to give some feedback and then maybe express some frustration or give some good suggestions to feed those back to Smarter Balance, but also to look at it as a state and say, do we have everything that we need in place? Are we addressing the needs of the schools and the districts in order to help them through this process? So we will collect that information, and it certainly would be our pleasure to report that to you.
Did you have another?
That information will include teacher observations, feedback, test questions, finances, online ability, the whole gamut.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by test questions.
Well, if the test questions are actually measuring the Common Core standard, in other words, how reliable are those questions? I'd like to know what the reliability standard is there, and to ensure that what we're measuring is in fact what we're teaching or what we're supposed to be aligned with.
Well, thank you for asking that. What was going on right now is a field test. And the field test is a test of the test. So what will happen, what will emerge on the other side of this field test is exactly as you request, are things like reliability and validity. And those standards are there very expressly. That's why what's being tested across the United States is about 7 million students. So the reliability and the validity would be able to be determined with that.
So when would that report be available for us?
I would assume that because of the aggressive schedule and the fact that the grant is going to run out for Smarter Balance at the end of September, that sometime before September. But I know, according to what their publications are, they've said that their priority, of course, is to, when the field test is done in June, to move straight ahead into making sure and into doing the reliability and the validity studies. Now, the second part of that, the qualitative dimension that you've asked about, is really something that we would spend a lot of time and energy collecting inside the state. Because as we've approached it in a different fashion, because first and foremost, what is important for all of us to recognize is that we are the most protected student information state that's out there. You could say that we have better protection than what Smarter Balance had ever originally designed, and it was us doing that. So there is no student identifiable information going out, and there is no non-academic questions being asked. So since we've done things a little bit differently in this state than other states may have done it, I think it's important for us to collect that information from how districts and schools experience the assessment, what their feedback is, and what the recommendations are for moving forward.
Thank you.
Representative Brokers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. Thanks for taking my question. I'm a representative here, and I'm also on the Manchester School Board. You know, we did the search last year. We found that leader that you spoke about before, Dr. Livingston. At least I believe that we did, and I think she's doing a nice job thus far. Having said that, you said before California has over 400 languages. You said something close to 500. You know, we have a school in Manchester that has over 50 languages spoken. Okay, we have that school has about 80% free or reduced lunch. You know, we're talking about testing. That school also doesn't have walls up. You know, it was that open concept that was built back in 1970. So, you know, and it's a lot of kids, minority kids that go to that school, you know, and I'm not going to say they're black or Hispanic or, you know, there's a lot
Diverse.
Diverse, yes, thank you. How, you know, what resources can the state give a school like that, which I think is the most diverse school in the state? If I don't know, that could be bold to say that, but I believe it's close to it.
Right.
What resources can the state give a school like that to, you know, building aid or something like that? I mean, you can't theoretically think you're going to improve test scores or get kids to read by 3rd grade if you don't have walls up. And I know that this is not a new problem. This has been there since 1972, whenever that school was built. But how can we improve test scores if we don't have those up? I mean, I'm just, and I don't want to say gotcha or anything like that, but, and you know,
And we're aware of that, and Dr. Livingston has spoken with us about the wall situation, and we're, you know, honestly looking into it. Our hands are tied. We do have greater flexibility with title money, and so our hope would be that we'd be able to provide an intervention for that particular school.
thank you.
Yeah. Can I just sum up? I just wanted to say, so you mentioned resources before, and I in the last 5 years as commissioner, I've never said this publicly, but I will say it. There is no discretionary money in the Department of Education's budget. Everything has been completely removed. So we rely totally and solely on our title money to be able to support innovation and the kinds of things that you talked about. And we also rely on foundation money. And the department has been amazingly active in trying to get foundations to come to our state and see the great work that we're doing. And so resources is an issue, and we're very, very aware of that. So the flexibility in our title money for our school districts, for your school to call and say, is there any way we can use funds this way, is exactly where we are, trying to find a way to get the money to where it needs to be the most. So really, really working on that, and that's part of the next flexibility waiver also.
Just as a basic question, how much do we get in federal funds for education?
You know, I'm not sure of the exact amount, and people have asked this several times. Do you remember the? I will give it to you. It's enormous. It's enormous.
It's about 6%.
6%.
Yeah.
That doesn't, 6%.
Yeah, I will give you the.
Right, yeah. But what's the total?
I mean, it's.
850
If I remember the last count, it was $869 million.
million. So 6% of that is federal money, and
Yeah.
the rest of it is.
No, it's
No,
oh no,
that's not
no.
the way that works.
869 million is what we're receiving overall across all of the titles that we have.
And that includes state money as well, does it not?
No, that's not adequacy. That's separate. It's separate. I'm trying to think, what is the Title I total? Do you know? Do you remember?
Title I total, I thought was around 40 million?
40 million. So Title I alone is 40 million. Then we have all of our other titles. But I'll get you the exact amount. Yeah, I mean, last year we had a 2%. You know, with sequestration, we had a reduction in certain titles, and then at the last minute they reinstated several titles for us and brought it back up again. So I just don't have the exact amount.
No, I was going to say, if you might. Test every other grade. You know, I agree with Representative Guile here that perhaps we are testing too much, and the off year should be left to the school district, maybe to do more diagnostic testing to really help that teacher know what's ticking inside that kid.
I really want to go on record. I'm in total agreement with that, and if we can pull it off, we will do that. There's no interest on anyone in my department's part. You want to validate that? Of more testing, believe me. There's so many distractions, and that's a distraction for us. That's not where we want to put our energy. We want to put our energy in improving teaching and learning. We don't want to put our energy into testing, and I've been very public about that, so.
Well, thank you.
Good, well, thank you, Representative Reliance.
I just thought of one question. I don't know if all schools will do it, but follow the child. Doesn't this follow this child almost take the place of testing where a teacher can look and say, here's what that child did last year, here's what it did the year before, here's what it did. Isn't that almost part of testing?
Well, the problem with that is the national issue on states and the federal dollars, that there has to be some built-in tool that the country can use. But there is a lot of pushback on these kinds of issues. Follow the child really is like a no child left behind kind of concept. If people had the in-depth training to be able to really do the analysis and diagnostics on children, then the interventions would be improved. And that's what gets back to Representative Vlad's question. If we improve the effectiveness of teachers, how will that overall improve our schools in teaching and learning? Well, that's a big issue. We need to improve our teachers. That doesn't mean they're bad teachers. It just means they have to have greater tools to be able to do the work. If you can't read in kindergarten, if you can't do letters in kindergarten, and you're having a hard time understanding conceptual things, and then you go to first grade, and all of a sudden, we all know the problem with the first grade curriculum. Then you get to second grade, and then you finally get to third grade, and you're still not reading. You have to wonder what went wrong that a child that doesn't have a learning challenge has gone through 4 years of school and is still not reading. I mean, this is what we're trying to understand. So follow the child has a lot of different implications to it, and people need the tools to be able to do that.
Great. Well, thank you very, very,
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thanks.
This has been a big help, and we will be attacking our interim study bills on assessment. Not probably to organize in June, but then to meet in August and September. And I know we'll be calling on you again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Scott. Well, committee, I guess we'll wait and see what happens to our bills and the Senate.
Jenny, don't leave it up.
We'll see you all tomorrow
I don't.
on the floor. I
You,
submitted our
I only thought it
representative drafting. I don't think we have a chance that our bills are going to be full.
The results of Smarter Balance test
Well, Kevin,
that I would do.
Sure. No, it doesn't seem to be.
I understand that's going to be a big sum.
I'll be roll call, right? Hashtag the only major
You know how much they get. 119 million. Or 116 million, depending on what number you
it should be
They just said there's no money.
between 116 and 119 million.
Adequacy? She couldn't sound like it was a whole 169.